Sinister Bells at Hawthorne Vicarage, a Miss Marple mystery. Settle in, dear listener, and allow me to draw you into another quiet corner of English village life, one shaped by routine, reverence, and the comforting certainty of church bells marking the hours. Hawthorne Vicarage has always stood at the heart of its village, a place of counsel, charity, and carefully maintained appearances. Its bells ring with dependable regularity, calling the faithful to prayer, reminding the restless of order, and reassuring everyone that some things remain unchanged. But when those bells begin to ring at the wrong time, when no service is scheduled, no hand is on the rope, and no one can explain why, unease seeps quietly into the village. At first it is dismissed as coincidence. Old mechanisms fail. Sounds travel oddly in the countryside. People smile, excuse, and move on. Yet Miss Jane Marple has learned that unexplained repetitions are rarely accidental. Then a death follows. Not dramatic, not violent. A passing that could easily be attributed to age or frailty, if not for the bells that rang just moments before, and again the night after, and again when no one was near the tower at all. Miss Marple listens. She listens to the villagers' reassurances, to their hurried explanations, to the stories that change slightly with each telling. She notices who grows nervous at the sound of the bells, and who pretends not to hear them at all. Because bells, Miss Marple knows, are meant to summon attention. And someone at Hawthorne Vicarage wants very much to control when and why that attention is drawn. So follow the sound across the churchyard, step into the vicarage halls, and listen closely. For when bells ring without hands to guide them, something far more sinister than coincidence is at work. The bell that rang alone. Hawthorne Village measured time by its bells. They rang at 7 each morning, at noon, and again at 6 in the evening, never early, never late. For generations, villagers had adjusted their lives around that rhythm. Bread was checked in ovens when the noon bell rang. Children hurried home at 6. The elderly paused mid-conversation, reassured that the world was still keeping order. So when the bell rang at 4:30 on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, everyone noticed. Miss Jane Marple was visiting Mrs. Huxley, a distant relation whose health required frequent supervision. They were seated by the window, tea cooling on the small table between them, when the sound drifted across the village, clear, deliberate, unmistakable. Mrs. Huxley stiffened. "That's odd," she murmured. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes," she said gently, "it is." The bell rang once more, then stopped. "There's no service today," Mrs. Huxley continued, "and the verger never rings it at that hour." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "he doesn't." By early evening, explanations were circulating: a mechanical fault, a child pulling the rope, sound carrying strangely in warm air. Miss Marple listened to each with polite interest and accepted none of them. Later that night, the bell rang again. This time it was followed by shouting. The news spread quickly. Mr. Edwin Clark, the vicarage's longtime caretaker, had been found collapsed in the churchyard near the bell tower steps. He was alive when discovered, but only just. Miss Marple arrived with the others, her movements calm amid the confusion. Mr. Clark lay on his back, his cap fallen beside him, one hand resting awkwardly near the tower door. His breathing was shallow. His face, pale and slick with sweat, bore an expression not of pain, but of shock. "I heard it," he whispered hoarsely as Dr. Myers knelt beside him. "Heard what?" the doctor asked. "The bell," Clark murmured. "It rang, and I knew." "Knew what?" someone pressed. Clark's eyes fluttered. "That it was time." He lost consciousness moments later. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the gathering, observing. The bell rope hung motionless inside the tower doorway. No one had touched it. The mechanism above was old but well maintained. Clark himself was known for his meticulous care. "Heart trouble," Dr. Myers said eventually. "He's had episodes before." "Did he often work alone at night?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Dr. Myers hesitated. "Not usually." "And today?" Miss Marple pressed. "He said he needed to check something in the tower," the doctor replied. "Something he'd noticed earlier." "What had he noticed?" Miss Marple asked. The doctor shook his head. "He didn't say." The villagers dispersed slowly, subdued by unease rather than grief. Miss Marple lingered. She examined the base of the tower steps. The stone was dry, no sign of a fall, no evidence Clark had slipped. He had not been running. His cap lay neatly beside him, not flung aside. Someone had stopped here deliberately. Inside the tower, Miss Marple peered past the doorway. The rope was still, yet faintly, unmistakably, the air smelled of oil, fresh oil, not long-settled residue. "Curious," she murmured. That night the bell did not ring again. By morning, Edwin Clark was dead. The official cause was listed as heart failure. His age and condition made it plausible. The village accepted it with visible relief, except Miss Marple did not. She visited the vicarage shortly after breakfast. Reverend Miles Hawthorne received her politely, though with faint impatience. "A tragic loss," he said. "Edwin served faithfully for nearly 30 years. "And the bells?" Miss Marple asked. "A coincidence," the Reverend replied quickly. "Old systems misbehave." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "They do, but rarely with such timing." The Reverend smiled tightly. Outside, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Bellows, the organist. "He was frightened," Mrs. Bellows whispered. "Edwin, I mean." "He said the bells were wrong." "Wrong how?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bellows shook her head. "He said they rang when they shouldn't, that someone was using them as a signal." "A signal?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes," Mrs. Bellows said, "and that he meant to stop it." Miss Marple looked back at the tower. Edwin Clark had not died because his heart failed him. His heart had failed because he understood something that frightened him enough to bring him running to the tower at the wrong hour. And someone, Miss Marple suspected, had known exactly how terrifying those bells could be. Do you believe the bells caused Edwin Clark's death? Or were they meant as a warning? Share your theory below. When bells become warnings. By the second day after Edwin Clark's death, Hawthorne Village had already begun to settle itself into acceptance. Miss Marple recognized the signs immediately. The bell did not ring again. The vicarage doors remained open. Conversations returned, carefully, to safer subjects. A death attributed to age was far easier to bear than one requiring explanation. And yet the unease lingered. Miss Marple spent the morning walking through the churchyard, her steps measured, her attention seemingly idle. In truth, she was listening. Listening to the rhythm of voices, to the pauses, to the moments where reassurance sounded rehearsed rather than sincere. Near the Lich Gate she encountered Mr. Samuel Brixley, the verger. "I expect you're relieved," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "that the bells have behaved themselves." Brixley's expression flickered. "They always have," he replied. "Mostly." "Mostly?" Miss Marple prompted. "Well," he said, shifting his weight, "they're old. They do things sometimes." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but bells don't ring themselves." Brixley glanced toward the tower. "No. Someone has to pull the rope." "And who has access?" Miss Marple asked. "The vicar, myself. Edwin did, of course, and occasionally the organist if she needed to coordinate timing." "Mrs. Bellows?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Brixley said, "though she's not fond of climbing." Miss Marple nodded and moved on. Inside the church, Mrs. Bellows sat at the organ bench, fingers resting on the keys without playing. "I keep thinking I hear it," she said quietly when Miss Marple approached. "The bell, I mean." "And do you?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Mrs. Bellows replied. "But Edwin said it would happen again, that if he didn't stop it, someone else would." "Did he say who?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bellows shook her head. "Only that it wasn't meant for us." "That's an odd thing to say," Miss Marple remarked gently. "He was frightened," Mrs. Bellows said. "Not of death, of what the bell signaled." Miss Marple left the church and crossed to the vicarage. Reverend Hawthorne received her again, this time with visible fatigue. "I understand you were close to Edwin Clark," Miss Marple said. "He was dependable," the Reverend replied. "A good man." "And he was concerned about the bells," Miss Marple added. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. Edwin worried excessively. "About what exactly?" Miss Marple asked. "About changes," the Reverend said. "Things he didn't understand." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "or things he understood too well." Hawthorne stood abruptly. "I don't believe this line of inquiry is helpful." Miss Marple rose calmly. "I quite understand." Outside she paused near the tower door. It was locked. That was new. Miss Marple walked around to the side entrance and noticed faint marks on the stone near the handle, oil stains, recently wiped but not entirely erased. Fresh oil. The same scent she had noticed the night Edwin collapsed. That afternoon, Miss Marple met Inspector Graves, newly arrived at the village. "The death was natural," he said cautiously. "Medically speaking." "And practically?" Miss Marple asked. Graves raised an eyebrow. "Someone wanted Edwin Clark frightened," she continued. "Frightened enough to run to the tower." "And frightened people die," Graves said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Especially those with weak hearts." Graves considered this. "You think the bell was rung deliberately?" "I think it was rung precisely," Miss Marple said. "At a time when Edwin would hear it. At a time when it would mean something to him." "What might it mean?" Graves asked. Miss Marple looked toward the church. "A warning," she said, "or a summons." That evening the village gathered for Edwin Clark's funeral. The bells rang, properly this time, slow, measured, correct. Miss Marple stood among the mourners, her gaze drifting upward to the tower. She noticed who avoided looking at it. She noticed who flinched when the bell sounded. And she noticed one thing more troubling than all the rest. As the final toll faded, a single faint echo followed, out of rhythm, almost imperceptible. Not a malfunction, a message. Someone was still using the bells. And Edwin Clark, Miss Marple suspected, had died because he tried to stop them. Do you believe the bells were used to frighten Edwin Clark, or to communicate with someone else entirely? Share your theory below. The language of bells. Miss Marple had always believed that every community developed its own private language. Sometimes it was built of gestures, sometimes of glances, sometimes of carefully chosen silences. In Hawthorne Village, she was beginning to understand that language rang in bronze. The morning after Edwin Clark's funeral, the village awoke to an uneasy quiet. The bells did not ring at 7 as they usually did. No one mentioned it aloud, but several villagers paused mid-task, waiting for a sound that never came. Miss Marple noticed every pause. She walked toward the church shortly after breakfast and found the doors unlocked once more. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and old stone. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting fractured colors across the pews. Mrs. Bellows sat at the organ bench again, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They didn't ring this morning," she said without turning. "No," Miss Marple replied. "And that, too, is a message." Mrs. Bellows turned slowly. "You believe someone is using the bells to communicate?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that bells are very effective for that purpose. They carry far, they draw attention, and most people assume they are meaningless." Mrs. Bellows swallowed. "Edwin said there was a pattern." "A pattern?" Miss Marple prompted. "Yes," Mrs. Bellows said. "He said the bells rang outside the schedule only when certain people were nearby, as though someone was being alerted." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Did he say who?" "No," Mrs. Bellows replied. "Only that it had begun recently, and that it frightened him." Miss Marple left the church and walked slowly around the building, counting her steps, measuring distances. From the tower, the bell could be heard clearly across the vicarage garden, down the lane toward the old rectory cottages, and, most notably, toward the far hedgerow that bordered the abandoned coach road. A perfect signal. Inspector Graves joined her near the hedgerow. "You were right," he said quietly. "The bell rope shows signs of recent use, controlled use, not frantic, not sloppy." "Someone careful," Miss Marple said, "and practiced." Graves nodded. "And someone who wanted the sound heard, but not questioned." They walked together toward the old coach road. It was little more than a dirt track now, overgrown in places, rarely used. "Who still goes this way?" Miss Marple asked. "Very few," Graves replied, "except Reverend Hawthorne. He takes it when visiting parishioners who prefer privacy." Miss Marple stopped walking. "Privacy," she repeated softly. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to the vicarage. Reverend Hawthorne greeted her with strained courtesy. "You've returned," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I was hoping you might help me understand something." Hawthorne gestured toward a chair. "If I can." "Do you ever use the bells to signal parishioners?" Miss Marple asked. The Reverend laughed lightly, too lightly. "Of course not." "But you do walk the old coach road," Miss Marple continued. "Yes," Hawthorne said, "occasionally." "And the bells rang when you did," Miss Marple added quietly. Hawthorne's smile faltered. "I don't know what Edwin told you," he said sharply, "but I won't have my integrity questioned." Miss Marple rose calmly. "Integrity," she said, "is rarely harmed by questions, only by answers."
That evening the bell rang again. Once, short, sharp. Miss Marple stood at her window and listened. From the far end of the village she saw a light flicker on near the old rectory cottages, then disappear. The bell had spoken, and someone had listened. Miss Marple sat down and began knitting slowly, her thoughts aligning like stitches. Edwin Clark had recognized the pattern. He had realized the bells were not ringing randomly, they were announcing movement, warning someone, or covering something that required secrecy, and Edwin, loyal and meticulous, had decided to interfere. The bell that rang the night he collapsed had not been a mistake.
It had been a test, a warning. And when Edwin responded, as the signaler expected, he had confirmed that he understood too much. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. The bells of Hawthorne were not instruments of worship anymore. They were instruments of control, and whoever rang them believed sound itself could be used to rule the village. But Miss Marple knew better. Every language, once understood, lost its power. Who do you think the bells were meant to warn, and what secret required such careful signals? Share your theory below. The rope no one touched. Miss Marple had long believed that the most revealing clues were those people insisted could not exist. In Hawthorne Village, that clue was the bell rope. By mid-morning, word had spread that the tower would be inspected. Inspector Graves arrived with a locksmith and the verger,
Samuel Brixley, whose unease was visible in the way he avoided looking directly at the tower door. "It hasn't been used since the funeral," Brixley said quickly. "I made sure of it." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "You locked it." "That's right." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "the bell rang again last night." Brixley swallowed. "People imagined it." Miss Marple did not argue. She rarely did when people were trying very hard to convince themselves. Inside the tower, the air was cool and close. Dust motes floated in the thin shafts of light slipping through the narrow openings. The bell rope hung straight and still, its fibers worn smooth by years of use. Inspector Graves examined the mechanism carefully. "No signs of forced entry," he said. "No obvious tampering." Miss Marple stepped closer, peering upward. "May I?" she asked.
She did not touch the rope. Instead, she examined the wall beside it, where faint marks had been left, as though something had brushed against the stone repeatedly. "Rope burn," Graves murmured, "but not from pulling downward."
"Upward," Miss Marple said. "Someone standing here would pull down. Someone elsewhere might pull sideways."
They followed the marks. Behind a loose stone panel, so cleverly disguised it appeared part of the original masonry, they found a narrow aperture. Inside, a secondary cord ran through a small pulley system, disappearing into the thickness of the wall. Graves let out a slow breath. A relay.
"Yes," Miss Marple said. "The bell could be rung from somewhere else."
"Without ever touching the rope," Graves finished.
"Precisely."
The verger went pale. "That's impossible."
"On the contrary," Miss Marple said.
"It's ingenious." The cord, Graves confirmed, ran downward through the wall and exited near the base of the tower, where it connected to a removable handle. Someone could attach it briefly, pull once or twice, and remove it again, leaving no obvious sign. "And Edwin Clark would have noticed," Graves said quietly.
"Yes,"
Miss Marple agreed,
"because he knew every sound the tower made."
Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked toward the old rectory cottages. She had noticed the flicker of light after the bell rang. Now she wanted to see what lay at the end of that signal. One cottage, set slightly apart, bore signs of recent attention.
Fresh oil at the door hinge, footprints carefully swept away, curtains always drawn. She knocked. The door was opened by Mrs. Penelope Ashcroft, a woman of refined manners and careful speech.
She had been a parish benefactor for years, known for her generosity and her discretion. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "how unexpected." "I wondered," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "whether you ever hear the bells from here." "Of course," Mrs. Ashcroft said. "Everyone does." "And when they ring unexpectedly?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ashcroft smiled. "Old churches do that." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but old habits do not." Inside, Miss Marple noticed a coil of thin rope tucked neatly beside the fireplace, far too new to belong to the cottage. Mrs. Ashcroft followed her gaze. "Garden line," she said quickly. Miss Marple nodded. "Of course." That evening, Inspector Graves brought confirmation. "The secondary cord exits near Ashcroft's property," he said. "Close enough for someone to reach quickly." "And close enough for Edwin Clark to follow the sound," Miss Marple added. They stood together near the tower as dusk settled. "Why frighten him?" Graves asked. "Because he was reliable," Miss Marple replied. "Because he would investigate. And because investigation was dangerous." The bell had not killed Edwin Clark directly. Fear had. Fear triggered by a sound designed to summon him, repeated, precise, unavoidable. And now that Miss Marple understood the mechanism, she understood something else as well. This was not a crime of impulse, it was a system, and systems were built by people who believed they were untouchable. Do you think the bell mechanism was created for one crime, or has it been used before? Share your theory below. What the bells protected. Miss Marple had often observed that elaborate methods were rarely designed for simple crimes. People who went to such trouble usually did so to protect something they believed far more valuable than life itself. In Hawthorne Village, that something lay behind the walls of the vicarage. The discovery of the hidden bell mechanism unsettled the community in ways no accusation could have managed. Villagers spoke in hushed tones now, not merely out of grief, but out of fear that the quiet order they relied upon had been engineered rather than earned. Miss Marple watched the shift with quiet patience. She began the day with a visit to the parish records room, a narrow space adjoining the church vestry. Dusty ledgers lined the shelves, some dating back more than a century. Mrs. Bellows accompanied her, unlocking the door with trembling hands. "Edwin helped me catalog these," she said. "He knew them all." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is why he was dangerous." They worked slowly, Miss Marple's gloved fingers tracing the spines of old books until she found what she was looking for. A ledger newer than the others, its pages unusually well preserved. "May I?" she asked. Mrs. Bellows nodded. Inside were entries relating to charitable donations, significant sums marked as anonymous gifts to parish causes. The handwriting changed subtly midway through the book. Miss Marple noticed immediately. "This hand," she said softly, "is not Edwin Clark's." "No," Mrs. Bellows agreed. "It belongs to Reverend Hawthorne." Miss Marple turned a few pages further. The donations coincided with periods of unexplained expenditure, repairs, refurbishments, and discretionary spending that never appeared in the public accounts. "Respectability," Miss Marple murmured, "is often expensive." Later that morning she visited Mrs. Ashcroft again. This time Mrs. Ashcroft did not bother with pleasantries. "You believe I frightened Edwin Clark," she said coolly. "I believe," Miss Marple replied,
that you helped someone do so. Mrs. Ashcroft's eyes hardened.
I have supported this parish for decades.
And in return, Miss Marple said gently, you were granted discretion. Mrs. Ashcroft laughed softly.
Discretion is a courtesy.
It is also a shield, Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Ashcroft rose.
If you have an accusation, make it.
In due course, Miss Marple said calmly. That afternoon, Inspector Graves brought troubling news.
The bell mechanism has been there for years, he said.
Longer than Edwin's tenure. Miss Marple nodded.
So it wasn't built to kill him?
No, Graves agreed. It was built to protect something.
They walked together toward the vicarage. The bells were used to signal when the coach road was clear, Graves said, when certain visitors could come and go unnoticed. Visitors who valued privacy, Miss Marple added.
Yes, Graves replied, and who paid handsomely for it.
Miss Marple stopped walking. So the bells rang not for worship, she said softly, but for convenience.
Exactly, Graves said.
They entered the vicarage garden, where Reverend Hawthorne stood speaking with parish council members. He turned, his expression carefully neutral.
You've found something, he said.
Yes, Miss Marple replied, and so did Edwin Clark. Hawthorne's eyes flickered.
He realized, Miss Marple continued, that the bells were being used to mask movements, discreet meetings, unrecorded donations, arrangements that could not withstand scrutiny.
Hawthorne folded his hands.
You misunderstand.
I understand perfectly, Miss Marple said. Edwin understood too. And when he threatened to expose the system, someone decided to frighten him into silence.
Frightened people don't always die, Hawthorne said.
No, Miss Marple replied, but those with weak hearts often do.
As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple felt the net tightening. The bells had protected a network of privilege and secrecy. Mrs. Ashcroft had provided access. Reverend Hawthorne had provided authority. Edwin Clark had provided silence, until he refused. What remained was the question Miss Marple always saved for last.
Who decided fear was not enough? Because the bell that rang alone that afternoon had not been meant merely as a warning. It had been rung with the knowledge that Edwin Clark would respond. And that response, Miss Marple believed, had been counted on. Do you believe Edwin Clark's death was an unintended consequence, or the calculated risk of protecting a secret? Share your theory below. The moment fear became intent. Miss Marple had long ago learned to recognize the precise moment when a scheme crossed from precaution into intent. It was never loud, never dramatic. It arrived quietly, when someone decided that consequences were acceptable. In Hawthorne Village, that moment had come with the ringing of a single bell. The day after her conversation with Reverend Hawthorne, Miss Marple returned to the churchyard at an hour when she knew most villagers would be occupied indoors. The air was still, the light pale and undecided. She positioned herself where Edwin Clark had collapsed and closed her eyes, listening. The village sounded ordinary. That, she thought, was the danger. Inspector Graves joined her shortly afterward, carrying a thin folder.
We've traced the financial trail, he said. Anonymous donations routed through Mrs. Ashcroft, approved by Hawthorne, recorded vaguely by Edwin.
And Edwin began to object, Miss Marple said.
Yes, Graves replied. He questioned the lack of transparency, asked for explanations.
And that, Miss Marple said softly, made him a liability.
They walked slowly toward the tower. "Here's what troubles me," Graves continued.
If frightening Edwin was meant to silence him, why ring the bell again after he collapsed? Miss Marple stopped walking. "That," she said, "is the question that matters." She entered the tower and studied the hidden relay once more. The cord was expertly concealed. Only someone deeply familiar with the structure would know how to operate it without leaving signs. "Someone rang it again," Graves said, "to see if he would respond." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "to confirm whether fear had worked, or whether something more would be required." They exited the tower and crossed the churchyard toward the vicarage garden. Miss Marple paused near a hedge and examined the ground. "Fresh soil," she murmured, "recently disturbed." Graves crouched beside her. Someone was standing here, watching the tower. "Waiting," Miss Marple corrected. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested a meeting in the parish sitting room. Mrs. Ashcroft arrived precisely on time. Reverend Hawthorne followed shortly thereafter. The verger, Samuel Brixley, hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether he belonged. Miss Marple began without preamble. "Edwin Clark did not die because the bells rang," she said calmly. "He died because someone needed to know whether fear alone would control him." Reverend Hawthorne stiffened. "That is speculation." "No," Miss Marple replied. "It is pattern." She turned to Mrs. Ashcroft. "You provided access to the coach road. You funded repairs that included the relay system." Mrs. Ashcroft smiled faintly. "Charitable improvements." "You enjoyed privacy," Miss Marple said. "And you ensured it." Mrs. Ashcroft said nothing. Miss Marple turned next to Reverend Hawthorne. "You authorized the use of the bells outside services," she continued. "You justified it as convenience." Hawthorne's voice was calm. "I never intended harm." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you accepted risk." "And Edwin's death?" Hawthorne asked sharply. Miss Marple met his gaze. "Someone rang the bell after Edwin collapsed," she said. "Someone wanted to know if he would come again." The room fell silent. Mrs. Ashcroft's composure faltered. "That second ringing," Miss Marple continued, "served no practical purpose. It was not a warning. It was a test." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Phone records place Reverend Hawthorne near the tower both times the bell rang," he said. Hawthorne's expression changed, not to fear, but to calculation. "I went to check on Edwin," he said. "Concerned for his well-being?" "After summoning him," Miss Marple said gently. Hawthorne's voice rose. "He threatened everything. The parish, the charities, people who trusted me." "And so," Miss Marple said softly, "you decided fear was acceptable." Hawthorne shook his head. "I never meant for him to die." "No," Miss Marple replied, "but you rang the bell knowing his heart might not withstand it." Silence settled heavily. The verger spoke at last, his voice trembling. "You told me to keep the tower locked. You said Edwin was imagining things." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because imagining fear is easier than confronting truth." Inspector Graves moved closer to Hawthorne. "At some point," he said, "this stops being negligence." Miss Marple folded her hands. "The bells were never meant to kill," she said. "They were meant to control." Edwin's death was not the plan, but it was an acceptable outcome. Hawthorne's shoulders sagged slightly. "I built something good," he said quietly. "I protected people." "You protected a system," Miss Marple replied. "Not the people within it."
As Hawthorne was escorted from the room, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only the familiar sadness that came when someone mistook authority for righteousness. The bells of Hawthorne had not rung by accident. They rang because someone believed sound could command obedience, and Edwin Clark died because he refused to obey. Do you believe Reverend Hawthorne crossed the line knowingly, or convinced himself the risk was justified? Share your thoughts below. When authority cracks authority, Miss Marple had often reflected, was most dangerous when it wore the mask of benevolence.
The removal of Reverend Hawthorne from the vicarage did not produce the shock one might have expected. Instead, it created a peculiar quiet, an unsettled stillness in which villagers went about their routines with exaggerated care, as though afraid that any sudden movement might expose them. The bells did not ring that morning. Miss Marple noticed the absence immediately. At the baker's shop, Mrs. Pell glanced at the clock twice before sliding a loaf across the counter.
"Strange," she murmured. "I didn't realize how much I relied on them." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Many people do not notice what guides them until it stops."
Outside, small groups gathered and dispersed again, conversations breaking off when others approached. Authority had not vanished, it had simply lost its certainty. Miss Marple walked toward the churchyard,
where Inspector Graves was speaking quietly with the verger.
"People want reassurance," Graves said when he noticed her. "They want to know this ends with Hawthorne." "Endings," Miss Marple replied, "are rarely so tidy."
She crossed the churchyard slowly, pausing at the tower steps where Edwin Clark had collapsed. Someone had left a small posy of flowers there, unremarkable, anonymous. Remorse, she thought, was often anonymous too. Mrs. Bellows joined her, her face drawn.
"I keep thinking of all the times I dismissed Edwin's worries," she said. "I told him he was imagining things." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly, "because imagining danger is easier than accepting responsibility."
Mrs. Bellows swallowed.
"Do you think we're all to blame?"
Miss Marple considered this carefully.
"Blame is not shared equally," she said.
"But responsibility often is." That afternoon, the parish council convened an emergency meeting in the village hall. Miss Marple attended quietly, sitting near the back. Voices rose and fell, some defensive, some indignant, some ashamed. Questions were asked about oversight, about donations, about how such a system could have existed unnoticed for so long. No one mentioned Edwin Clark's name at first. When it was finally spoken, the room fell silent. "He should have told someone sooner," a man near the front said.
"Yes,"
Miss Marple said calmly, breaking her silence. And when he did, someone frightened him into silence. All eyes turned toward her. "Edwin Clark was loyal," she continued. "Loyal to the church, to the village, to the idea that authority deserved trust. That loyalty was exploited." A woman near the wall began to cry softly. Inspector Graves stood. "The investigation isn't finished," he said. "There will be further inquiries." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Afterward, Miss Marple stepped outside into the fading light. Mrs. Ashcroft waited near the gate. "You've ruined us," she said quietly. "The charities, the reputation." Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. "No," she replied. "You ruined yourselves by believing the ends excused the means." Mrs. Ashcroft's voice hardened. "People benefited." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but benefit without honesty is debt." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her lodging and sat by the window as dusk settled. For the first time since her arrival, the village felt unanchored. The bells had governed rhythm, authority, permission.
Without them, or without trust in what they represented, people were forced to rely on their own judgment. That, Miss Marple knew, was deeply uncomfortable. A knock came at the door. It was Samuel Brixley, the verger. His hands trembled as he removed his cap. "I should have spoken," he said. "I saw the relay years ago. Hawthorne told me it was necessary, that it was for the good of the parish." "And you believed him?" Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," Brixley whispered, "because he was the vicar." Miss Marple nodded. "Authority is persuasive, especially when it speaks kindly." Brixley looked up. "Will Edwin be remembered?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes," she said, "but not as he should have been. That, too, is a consequence." Later that night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, a sound drifted faintly through the open window. Not a bell, a hammer. Inspector Graves had ordered the relay dismantled. Each metallic strike echoed softly through the village, deliberate and final. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The bells of Hawthorne had not been silenced by law or by force, but by understanding. Once their true purpose was known, they lost the power they once held. Yet the most difficult work remained: to live without unquestioned authority, to accept that trust must be earned repeatedly, and to remember that silence, once used as a tool, always demanded payment. Edwin Clark had paid with his life. The village would pay in memory. Do you think the villagers' silence made Edwin Clark's death inevitable? Or could one voice have changed everything sooner? Share your thoughts below. After the bells fell silent. The day after the relay was dismantled, Hawthorne Village woke to a sound it had not heard in years. Nothing. No 7 o'clock bell. No measured assurance that the morning had officially begun. Time, it seemed, had been returned to the villagers without instruction. Miss Marple noticed the effect immediately. People emerged from their cottages uncertainly, glancing at watches, consulting clocks, asking one another the hour. Small confusions multiplied. Deliveries arrived late. The baker burned a tray of loaves. Children reached school early, then too late. Order, once imposed, had quietly evaporated. Miss Marple walked through the village green, observing the subtle discomfort that spread like a draught through familiar rooms. Authority, she reflected, was easiest to accept when it removed the burden of choice. At the church, Inspector Graves supervised the final inspection of the tower. The relay cord lay coiled on the stone floor like a shed skin, its purpose exhausted. "It's strange," Graves said. "Once you see it for what it is, it feels so obvious." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is the nature of control. It depends upon not being examined." The tower door was left open now. No lock, no secrecy. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bellows at the organ loft. The woman sat quietly, her hands resting on the bench, not playing. "I don't know when to begin," she said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then begin when it feels right." Mrs. Bellows nodded, eyes filling briefly. "Edwin would have liked that." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "He believed order should serve people, not command them." Outside, the churchyard had changed subtly. Villagers lingered longer. Conversations took place where once there had been only passage. Without the bells dictating rhythm, people spoke until they were finished, not until they were summoned elsewhere. That afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to a small gathering at Mrs. Pell's home. No formal agenda, just tea. It was the first time several villagers had sat together without pretending that nothing had happened. The conversation was tentative at first, circling safely around weather and domestic concerns. Then someone mentioned Edwin Clark's name without lowering their voice. "He kept the place running," Mrs. Pell said. "All those years." "Yes," another replied, "and we never asked how." Miss Marple listened without interruption. "They say he tried to speak," a third voice added quietly.
More than once.
"Yes," Miss Marple said at last, "and each time someone decided it was inconvenient." Silence followed, not the old silence of avoidance, but a new one, heavier and more honest. Later, Miss Marple encountered Samuel Brixley again near the tower. He watched the open door with an expression somewhere between relief and loss. "I don't know my place anymore," he admitted. "You never lost it," Miss Marple said kindly. "You simply allowed someone else to define it for you." Brixley nodded slowly. "I won't do that again." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Most people don't, once they see the cost." That evening, Inspector Graves visited Miss Marple with final updates. "Hawthorne has been charged," he said. "Abuse of authority, negligence leading to death, financial misconduct." "And Mrs. Ashcroft?" Miss Marple asked.
Questioned, Graves replied. Her influence is diminished.
Miss Marple folded her hands. "Influence always is, once examined." Graves hesitated. "You know, some still insist Edwin's death was an accident." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "because accepting intention is uncomfortable." She stood and walked to the window. Outside, dusk settled over Hawthorne village. Lamps flickered on, not in response to a bell, but because someone decided it was time. Miss Marple felt a familiar quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but completion. Edwin Clark's death had not been avenged in the traditional sense. No dramatic exposure, no public spectacle. Instead, something subtler and perhaps more lasting had occurred. A system had been dismantled. A habit had been broken. A village had been forced to listen to itself.
Miss Marple turned back into the room. The bells of Hawthorne no longer ruled the village, and without them, people were beginning, slowly, awkwardly, to learn how to listen for themselves. Do you think the village is truly better without the bells? Or was the comfort they provided worth the cost? Share your thoughts below. The weight of quiet truths. Miss Marple had always found that truth, once revealed, rarely brought immediate peace. Instead, it settled slowly, like dust after a long disturbance, coating everything with a fine, unavoidable residue. Hawthorne Village was entering that stage now. The formal notices arrived on a Thursday morning. Inspector Graves ensured they were posted plainly. Investigations ongoing, accounts frozen, the vicarage temporarily closed pending review. Nothing sensational, nothing dramatic. Just the unmistakable confirmation that authority had consequences. Villagers read the notices carefully, some twice, as though repetition might soften their meaning. Miss Marple watched from a distance. At the grocer's shop, Mrs. Pell spoke in a low voice. "I never liked how smoothly things ran," she said. "It made one lazy." "Yes," her companion replied. "Too easy to assume someone else was minding matters." Miss Marple purchased her bread and moved on. Near the churchyard, a group of men discussed the fate of the bells themselves. "They'll ring again eventually," one said.
won't they?" "I hope so," another replied, "but properly this time." Miss Marple paused at the tower. The bells hung motionless inside, their bronze surfaces dulled by age. Without the relay, without the secrecy, they seemed almost harmless. Objects again, rather than instruments. She thought of Edwin Clark, moving through the tower with practiced ease, noting changes others missed. He had not been brave in the theatrical sense. He had simply been conscientious. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was often enough to put someone in danger. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Ashcroft outside her cottage. The woman looked diminished, as though something essential had been drained away, not wealth, but certainty. "They've taken my statements," Mrs. Ashcroft said coolly. "They're questioning everything now." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is how trust is rebuilt." Mrs. Ashcroft's lips tightened. "Edwin Clark should have understood discretion." "Discretion," Miss Marple said gently, "is not the same as silence." Mrs. Ashcroft looked away. "People benefited." "Some did," Miss Marple replied. "Others paid without knowing." That evening, Miss Marple joined Inspector Graves for a final walk through the village. "Do you think Hawthorne understood what he was risking?" Graves asked. "Yes," Miss Marple said without hesitation. "He understood just enough to believe he could manage it." "And Edwin's death?" Graves pressed. Miss Marple stopped walking. "Was foreseeable," she said quietly, "which makes it something far more serious than an accident." They continued on. Graves sighed. "Villages like this rely on routine. Breaking it leaves people adrift." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But routine that depends on deception is already broken." They reached the edge of the coach road. The hedgerows were overgrown now, the path scarcely visible. "It was convenient," Graves said. "That road." "And secrecy often is," Miss Marple replied. "Until it isn't." That night, Miss Marple sat in her room, packing slowly. She folded her clothes with care, pausing occasionally to gaze out at the village lights. Hawthorne looked peaceful again, almost convincingly so. But Miss Marple knew better. Peace built on unexamined authority was fragile. It required constant reinforcement, silence, compliance, the willingness to look away. Edwin Clark had broken that pattern simply by noticing. Miss Marple placed his name carefully into her memory, where she kept others like him, people who had not sought heroism, but had stumbled into consequence by doing their duty. In the distance, the church clock struck the hour, not the bell, the clock. A simple marking of time, without command or signal. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Time, she believed, was the one authority no one could truly manipulate forever. Tomorrow, she would leave Hawthorne Village behind, but the questions she had forced it to confront would remain. And perhaps, she hoped, the next time someone heard a bell ring when it should not, they would ask why, before fear could answer for them. Do you think Edwin Clark's quiet integrity was enough to change the village? Or will Hawthorne eventually slip back into old habits? Share your thoughts below. When the bells mean nothing at all. Miss Marple believed that endings were rarely loud. They arrived softly, disguised as ordinary mornings when the world appeared unchanged, but no longer felt the same. Hawthorne Village greeted its final reckoning in precisely that manner. The day Miss Marple prepared to leave, the sky was pale and cloudless. The air held the clean stillness that followed weeks of tension finally released.
Doors opened. Windows were unlatched. Life, cautiously, resumed. But something essential was missing. The bells remained silent. Miss Marple paused outside the churchyard, her small suitcase resting beside her. She gazed up at the tower, its familiar outline unchanged, its purpose quietly diminished. For the first time, the bells meant nothing at all. Inspector Graves joined her, his steps slower than usual. "Hawthorne is being remanded," he said. "Charges are proceeding. Financial records are being audited. Mrs. Ashcroft's influence is finished." Miss Marple nodded. "And the village?" Graves exhaled. "Learning, slowly." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is the only pace that lasts." They walked together toward the lich gate. "I keep thinking," Graves said, "that Edwin Clark never intended to be brave." "No," Miss Marple replied. "He intended to be thorough." Graves smiled faintly. "That may be braver." They stopped near the tower steps. Someone had placed fresh flowers there again, simple ones tied with twine, no card, no name. Remembrance, Miss Marple knew, did not require explanation. She turned back toward the village one final time. Mrs. Bellows stood at the church door, watching. When she saw Miss Marple, she approached. "I rang the organ this morning," she said. "No bells, just music." "And how did that feel?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bellows considered. "Honest." Miss Marple smiled. "That is enough." As she continued on, she passed Samuel Brixley, who tipped his cap respectfully. "I won't lock the tower again," he said quietly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "There's no need." The car waited at the end of the lane. As it pulled away, Miss Marple looked back once, just once, at Hawthorne Village. It lay peacefully in the sunlight, unremarkable, almost deceptively so. That was how such places always looked. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had shifted. The villagers would no longer wait to be told when to gather, when to disperse, when to look away. They would listen differently now, not for commands, but for meaning. Edwin Clark's death had not been spectacular. There were no raised voices, no struggle, no final words shouted into the night, but it had mattered. Because one man noticed what others ignored, because one man refused to accept that convenience outweighed truth, and because fear, once exposed, lost its power. As the village disappeared behind a bend in the road, Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. Somewhere else, another quiet place, another orderly system, someone was already relying on silence to maintain control. Someone believed they could ring a bell and expect obedience. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Bells could command attention, but they could no longer command belief. Do you believe Hawthorne Village truly learned from Edwin Clark's death? Or will silence find another way to return? Share your final thoughts in the comments below. And so, dear listener, Hawthorne Village returns to its quiet ways, not because it has forgotten, but because it has learned. The tower still stands. The bells still hang where they always have, yet their meaning has changed. No longer do they command obedience or conceal movement. They wait, silent, harmless, stripped of the power once granted to them by unquestioned trust. Edwin Clark's life did not end with noise or struggle. He did not die shouting warnings or demanding justice. He simply noticed what others ignored and refused to pretend it was nothing. In doing so, he revealed how easily kindness can be twisted into control, and how fear can be disguised as protection. Miss Marple leaves Hawthorne as she leaves all such villages, without ceremony, without expectation of thanks. Her work has never been about punishment. It has been about reminding ordinary people that authority must be examined, routines must be questioned, and silence must never be mistaken for peace. The villagers will ring the bells again someday. Of that there is little doubt. But when they do, it will be by choice, not habit. By understanding, not instruction. And perhaps that is the true legacy of this quiet crime, that truth does not always arrive with force, that justice does not always shout, and that the most dangerous lies are often hidden inside things that sound comforting. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for sharing this journey into the subtle shadows of village life. If this mystery stayed with you, let me know which moment rang loudest in your mind. Until our next story together, take care, and remember, when bells ring without reason, it is always worth asking, who is listening?